I want to welcome everybody here tonight to Cardus, to the 8th floor of Cardus at 45 Rideau. It's really good to see you. Some people I'm meeting for the first time, Jean-Marc, it's a pleasure to see you in person. I find that at these events, people that I've met on Zoom over time, I've actually see them in the flesh. And in Jean-Marc, in your case, you look even better in real life. And so I just want to welcome everybody to this event tonight. I'm really glad that you can be here in person. And I want to welcome you just to Cardus as an institution. I also want to recognize Michael Van Pelt, our president, who's here. Michael, I'm glad that you're here. We have a number of board members as well. Ernest Lang, who's a member of our board. Ernest, it's good to see you. And our board chair, Jeff Cowper. I hope I'm not missing anyone else, that I keep my job tomorrow. But we have a couple of board members here as well. So just thank you, board members, as well, for being here. This is Cardus. If you haven't met us before, Cardus is a Christian public policy think tank that works out of the Christian social tradition. And some people say, what the heck does that mean? They get a little afraid of that, and they think, you know, who are these people? Am I going to be subjected to tracts and Bible passages? We keep that for after you've had a few drinks. We find it's more effective that way. No, we actually are a think tank that was founded out of the labor movement, out of the Christian labor movement in Canada. That's actually sort of began in the 1970s, but in 2000, Cardus became an independent institution because we felt the need to be independent and be able to speak publicly about a range of issues, from education to work in economics to religious freedom, healthcare, family, and so on. And so we do that here at Cardus now on the 7th and 8th floors here, as well as in our office in Hamilton. We work out of a Christian social tradition that thinks that the point of public policy and the center of public policy should be persons. And that sounds like something that's just trivial, and of course everybody believes that. But there's a particular view of the human person and the way that they should be treated that we consider central to our policy recommendations and even to some of the questions that we ask when we're doing research. And work is one of those things. Out of the Christian social tradition, in the sort of papal social encyclicals starting in the 1890s, there was a strong push to realize that those people who were being subjected to massive market forces, to the response that everything should be nationalized or that it should become a sort of state central, that no, at the heart of this, there was a unique human person. And this is true for work as well. John Paul II said that at the heart of work and the heart of understanding what work is that the worker is a human person, or a human person capable of deciding for him or herself. And so that affects our view of labor unions. We tend to be a little bit more labor positive, which Angela is nodding happily about, than some other folks that you might imagine. And that has effects for public policy as well. And so tonight we're going to be talking about two of those things. We're going to be talking about the working class and the policy agenda that can hopefully serve those human persons and those workers. And it's something that I'm really much looking forward to. And we have tonight an extremely excellent panel that I'll introduce in a minute. But I'm just really glad that we have this panel here with us tonight. A few notes just in terms of the way Cardus does business. We take the Christian social tradition seriously, even in the way that we converse. And so we're here today and we host events to encounter ideas. We don't necessarily assume that everybody is going to be persuaded or to change their mind. You're not going to walk out of here necessarily having changed your mind, though perhaps you will. But what we want to do and what we want to ensure is that you've encountered those ideas and the people that are giving them to them. And so we expect that too in terms of our conversation. We hope the tone is charitable and meaningful, and that we're not here to score points necessarily, but to actually try to draw the ideas out. And so as I moderate tonight and as the questions come, we hopefully you can adopt that tone with us as well. So thank you very much. So I want to introduce our panel, and we'll get right into it from there. To my left, hey-o. Yes. Angela and I were talking about that one. I'm like, so am I to her left or her to her right? She's to my left in this case. Is Angela MacEwen. Angela MacEwen is a senior economist at the National Office for the Canadian Union of Public Employees. Clearly, she has an interest in work. Angela is actually, Angela, I first met you on Twitter, and I've actually was always appreciative of your tone and very constructive, and does good work, and is actually a very, very thoughtful person. And so, Angela, I'm grateful that you're here, and welcome to Cardus as well. It's your first time here as well. To her left is Renze Nauta. Renze is our program director for work and economics here at Cardus. He's recently joined us We took him out of politics. He's a political refugee. And so we try to make a home for political refugees, a safe space for them to recover from their tours. Renze is one of the authors of the project of the working class paper, the Defining the Working Class paper, that is the subject at the heart of this. And so, Renze, I'm glad that you're here as well, and I hope we have a good conversation tonight. To his left, as we continue that journey, is Armine Yalnizyan. Armine is an economist and an Atkinson Fellow at the Future of Workers, a fellow for the Future Work. I'm messing this up. She's with the Atkinson Foundation, and she does really great work. Armine and Armine and Cardus sometimes don't agree on all things, but the one thing you can say about Armine is that she is a passionate public speaker, a good public speaker, somebody who I think actually really cares about the country, really cares about workers. And so, Armine, this is your first time here as well, and I'm really grateful from the bottom of my heart that you're here in person. I can meet you in the flesh, and that we can just encounter one another and talk to one another. So thank you so much for making time to be here. And at the far left of is Sean Speer, who is editor-at-large at the Hub. Sean does all kinds of things, but I wanted to keep it short. Editor-at-large at the Hub. This event is being co-sponsored by the Hub. The Hub is a relatively new journalistic outfit, and Sean's one of the editors-at-large. I highly recommend it to you. It's some of the most interesting content you're going to find on Canadian politics, Canadian society, and public life. Sean is also the host of the Hub Dialogues, which in my mind is increasingly becoming one of my favorite podcasts. So I encourage you to pay for the subscription to the Hub and listen to into the podcast, if only so that Sean can continue to put bread on the table. So if nothing else, you'll get good information at the same time. So thank you all for being here, and thank you. So I'm going to move into sort of the opening of our talk tonight. I'm going to start with you, Renze. So you're one of the authors of the paper. Maybe you can set the table for us. Tell us a little bit about what was the paper, what it's about, what it's there, and what you found.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think I'd like to start with almost why we did the paper as well, because I think it's important. And Sean, this paper is really the brainchild, I think, of Sean Speer, and our collaborator on this with Cardus. But I would also be remiss if I didn't mention our third co-author, Susina Bazoo, who did some fantastic data analysis, very interesting, which I think we're going to get into in this conversation. So to frame the paper a little bit, there's been increasing discussion at the political level around the working class. It's creeping into the conversation more and more, and in some ways, I think what we're seeing is that the conversation around the working class is very similar to what we saw in the previous decade around the middle class. Famously, there was one political party that oriented its platform toward the middle class and those working hard to join it. One of the problems I think that debate had was a lack of definition. And you saw, I think, in some of the political discussion around it, and then the subsequent, I don't mean to be too polemical, but some of the policy that resulted around it, it wasn't always very well defined, and therefore the policy was not necessarily well targeted. The middle class tax cut, I think there was a lot of discussion around whether the middle class tax cut was in fact targeted toward the middle class or those working hard to join it. So that, I think, is part of the genesis of this paper, is if we're going to have a conversation about the working class, let's find out who exactly they are and how do they fit into the broader labor market. So that's precisely what our paper tries to do. It establishes a definition, which we actually borrow from the IMF and the World Bank, I believe, and we apply it to a Canadian context. Then we look at some of the demographic data, and then we offer the broad contours of a policy agenda that would speak to the interests of the working class. So, what is the definition of the working class? We're talking about people who are in jobs that do not require a post-secondary credential. It doesn't mean, by the way, that they don't have those post-secondary credentials, which is an interesting point that we're going to get into later, I hope. But it's people in those jobs that require a high school education or less, or at the very most, on-the-job training. So how do they fit into the labor market as a whole? Well, we borrow this from from Statistics Canada. So this is a pretty well defined taxonomy. The working class is distinguished from the professional class, which is those who are in jobs that do require a university degree. The technical class, which is those who are in jobs that require a college or trade school or apprenticeship certificate or diploma. And the managerial class, which would be a bit of those are the senior managers, a little bit more than the C-suite, but it's what we would call the managerial class. So when you take a look at the working class from that angle, you can do some demographic analysis of that, and a very interesting picture emerges, and that's really the heart of our paper. We call the paper Canada's New Working Class, because what we find is that the working class in Canada today is quite different than what we would consider the stereotype. So the stereotype is a male worker who has a blue collar job in the goods producing sector. So think Oshawa, think the auto sector, or so in a General Motors facility, or Domtar mill hand. And what we find is that when you look at the data, Canada's working class looks very different. The working class of today is as likely to be female as it is male. It's very likely to be recently immigrated to Canada. It is very significantly in the services producing sector. And so when we think of the working class, we ought to be thinking more of a restaurant server or an Amazon delivery driver, and who is female, and who may not look at all like the stereotype that we think. So in short, the working class in Canada has gone over the last several decades from making stuff to serving and caring for people. So there's more to say, and I think we're going to get into it. But do you want me to get into the size right now?
Let's hold off on that until we. Okay. Because what I want to do is I want to actually ask Angela, Armine, and Sean just to respond briefly and say, like, should we even care about the working class? Given why is it that this is a helpful lens for us, and especially in terms of politics, right? Because we're a policy think tank. You work in policy. Armine works in policy. Sean discusses policy a lot. Used to work in the heart of it. Why should we even care? And so, Angela, perhaps I'll open with you, and then we can sort of pass down from there.
Sure. So when I was reading the paper, there's some great information in there, but I came really to see that, or to feel like there isn't one working class in Canada. That to say that everybody who is in a job that doesn't have a university degree describes a coherent class in terms of other economic, cultural, social terms, it might be a start for digging into that taxonomy, but it really doesn't give us that much useful information. For example, we know half of them have post-secondary education, but we don't know why they aren't in jobs. So is it mostly because it's immigrants that don't have credential recognition? Or is it people that are switching jobs and maybe they can make more money in their current job than they could have in the one that they had a diploma for? Or maybe they have a degree and they're working in a job where they don't require a degree, but they're actually kind of playing the long game, and they'll do better off in the long run because they have that education. And so it doesn't really tell us a lot about the situation of I don't see it tells us enough to give a policy direction about the working class in Canada. You have personal support workers who come to Canada on temporary foreign work visas, who are very different from construction workers that don't have any trade, the guys that do the road work, who's again very different from somebody who works in a salon or somebody who works at the mall. And they differ based on education, they differ based on gender, occupation, they differ based on income. And so there is no even universal income support program that would fit all of these workers. Some of them have kids, others don't. They might live in multi-generational homes, be in urban or rural areas. And so I find this is maybe a useful first step down that road. But why do I think that we should care about the working class? Why do I care about the working class? I would say that the owner of a small business has more in common with their employees than they do with the CEO of TELUS or David Thompson or JD Irving out east. And so that if you rely on work for a paycheck to feed your family, you are part of the working class. So I think the professional class is part of the working class. I think the managerial class is part of the working class. Anything could happen to us. Any day we could get injured, we could get hit by a bus, we could suffer some kind of debilitating illness. And all of a sudden we're relying on that social safety net that we built to meet the needs of the working class. And more than that, more than just the idea that this could happen to you, I want to live in a society where my neighbor, where anyone who runs into that situation is taken care of. And so that's why I think we need to care about the working class, because we care about people and we're all people and we could all be in that situation and our kids could all be in that situation.
Okay, that's a great response. I actually want to come back to that, the distinction between education level, wage earner, period, which I think is a fascinating one. Armine, you've actually done some work to talk about, you remember talking about the PSW, for instance. The care economy is something that you've done a lot of great work, and I actually encourage you to read Armine on that. Can you respond to that same question? You know, why should we care about the working class? Is it a helpful lens, as we've defined it? Is it a helpful lens when it comes to a policy agenda?
Well, given this is Cardus, and you have laid the table for it being a faith-based, at least starting from a faith-based platform, I would say there isn't a single faith on the surface of the planet that doesn't say treat others as you wish to be treated. The golden rule says that we need to be taking care of one another a little bit better than we are. And whereas I understand that there's distinctions between left and right on whether inequality of opportunity is more important than inequality of outcomes, inequality in and of itself is an issue. Every worker needs to be respected. Every worker needs to have access to the basic services that let them go to work and let them be healthy enough to work. So they need education, they need health, the care economy stuff, but they also need roads and bridges. They need it all, right, for us to operate at our full potential. But your question is more, you know, why should we care about them? In a political sense, if I remember correctly, the study says that it's about a third of all the workforce is in this working class. That is a third of any constituency is a political clout. And we have seen around the world that it has been the right side of the agenda, the conservative side of the agenda that has embraced the working class, that is the uneducated. Remember Trump and his son saying, we love the uneducated. They have embraced the working class as a way to advance their, expand their vote and actually get into power. So it is a potential lever for gaining power, for broadening your base. And I think the conservative movement in the UK and in the United States and here in Canada, most especially in Ontario, though Erin O'Toole did it also at the federal level. The idea of seizing this working for workers dynamic is like, which workers are you working for? You're not working for the care economy workers. You've made it worse for people that work in the care economy in this province under this leadership. You've rolled back minimum wage provisions. You rolled back paid sick days and didn't bring them back during a pandemic. Like, it's a beautiful trope, but what does it mean to want to be working for workers? And I think we are in the process of other parties catching up with the hypocrisy of working for workers. And we're going to have a very rich dialogue about what does it mean to work for workers and which workers are you working for? Are you working for the blue collar boys? Are you working for all workers? Are you working for poor workers? Are you working for rich workers? Are you letting them work for themselves? Because if you're a believer in free markets, the fastest way to get to yes is to sit down at a table and talk about things, which is another Christian and ILO idea, is that we should be listening to one another. And there has been so much of this shutting down of conversation amongst those who have power. Is I don't have to tell you anything. I'll tell you what you need to know. I don't need to talk. And if we don't talk, we don't get anywhere. We don't get towards wins that actually everybody can win because it's something you can all live with, and you've worked through the contours of the problems and you've come up with effective solutions for everybody. So I think it's remarkable that you're doing this work. I think the work of the report is very effective in that it lays out all the problematique. We'll talk a little bit later about the solutions, but I think it's a very effective piece of work that should be able to bring more people into the discussion of what does it mean to work for workers, which workers are we working for?
Can I just say 3 or 4 things? First of all, the very effective parts of the report I'm responsible for. The parts of the report that Angela raised concerns about, that's Renze's. Secondly, I just want to...
Brave, really brave.
You're so humble, Sean.
Secondly, I want to sincerely thank Cardus for supporting this work for a couple of reasons. First of all, what you don't know is it took longer than it ought to have, and they were patient and kind as the work was carried out. Secondly, there's not very many places in the country that would have supported a project like this, and I'm genuinely grateful to Lisa and Michael and Ray and Brian and Renze for trusting me and the team to carry out this work, to believe that it was making a useful contribution to some of the issues that Renze, Angela, and Armine have raised. The third point I'd put on the table, which reflects some of the things you've already heard, is I've observed some of the trends that Armine mentioned, which is increasingly conservative parties across the Anglosphere, conservative political figures, have been thinking and talking about the working class. Some of you may be familiar with some of the scholarship on the so-called realignment, the idea that across Western politics, we're seeing a kind of a concentration of support on the left amongst those in the professional class and those with post-secondary credentials, and a growing shift from the left to the right of those who aren't in the professional class and who don't have post-secondary credentials. And as Armine says, I think a lot of conservative figures see this as a potential opportunity. The challenge is that I think a lot of conservatives, when they talk about these issues, have an archaic conception of what the working class is. There's a tendency to talk about the working class as members of the goods-producing economy. You called them the blue-collar boys, I think. And it seems to me, if you're genuinely committed to a working-class politics, which I think isn't just normatively good, but as you say, I think holds out electoral prospects for center-right parties, it's fundamental that it's rooted in who the working class is and what they do. And you can only do that if you answer that question. And so part of, for me, the motivation of the paper was to understand who comprises the Canadian working class, what types of occupations they tend to be concentrated in, what are their economic, social outcomes, and so on. I mean, that ought to be a starting point for the development of such a policy agenda. And I hope in that sense, while the paper doesn't purport to outline a comprehensive agenda, hopefully it does inform the kind of empirical basis, at least a starting point, as Angela says, to that type of work, which I suppose comes to my final point, which is our hypothesis was right. That, well, it may be true at some point in Canadian history that the so-called working class was concentrated in the parts of the good-producing economy like manufacturing, energy. It hasn't been the case for a long time. As Renze said it in his remarks, increasingly the working class cares and serves people. It doesn't make things. And I think if your commitment is sincere across the political spectrum, then hopefully what we see is a policy debate, a clash of normative and kind of empirical differences about how to deliver on the interests and needs of the working class. And just one final point.
How many final points are you going to have, Sean?
Well, did I say final?
I'll give you that one. You sound like a minister at church.
It's like, remember when Rick Perry ran for president and he said he wanted to shut down 3 departments and then he forgot the 3rd one on stage? That's the risk of saying I have 4 points.
Okay.
No, but the last point, and you said you asked the question, why should we care? And I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that strikes me about the pandemic experience is that the way we talk about essential and non-essential workers was an inverse of what the market tends to value and benefit. People like me weren't essential, and people in the working class were essential. And it seems to me, having gone through this experience, we have a kind of collective obligation to support the people that stepped up in this kind of extraordinary set of circumstances. And so we ought to seize the moment and deliver on that. And in that sense, hopefully the paper can help.
Can I jump on what he just said?
Yeah, you can. As long as you don't have 14 points like Sean.
I don't have 14 points.
Go ahead, Armine.
I actually as you were talking, Sean, I was thinking, actually this working for workers thing started long before the pandemic. And you are right about how the pandemic threw an inversion into the mix as to who do we value, who's efficient, who's essential, all of that stuff. And so that was really important because that's the real stuff. That's the real deal. Like, you cannot get by without these people. But there was a whole other thing happening years before the pandemic, which was the beginning of a really anti-establishment movement. And if you think that my entire life as an economist was about trickle-down theory, and the people that we celebrated and vaunted were the people that made money, the people we built public policy around were the people that had money. Give them more money and they will make more wealth. And in so doing, jobs and wealth will trickle down. That was the mantra. More market, less government, cut taxes, deregulate, get out of the way of the wealth creators. That is what I have been spending my entire life fighting against for the last 40 years. And now you have this moment around, about 10 years, not even 10 years after the global financial crisis, of saying, drain the swamp. That was 2015 when the slogan drain the swamp came, and it was tapping into a deep anti-establishment ethic that started around 2010 with the Arab Spring. It was anti-establishment place after place after places. We can't live with this status quo. We've got to get rid of it. And then it kept accelerating everywhere. And the Trump party, but others too, seized on, we hate the elite. We hate the global order. It's screwing us over, right? It was channeling or kind of harnessing that voice that is not, it doesn't matter who the working class is. The people we are talking about politically are angry and they are anti-establishment. So whatever you do to seize that anger and anti-establishment spirit will win. And I think that's the distinction between the type of work you're doing, which is about how do you get good public policy for the working class, and raw politics, which is how do you seize and channel the momentum. And the momentum is anti-establishment at the moment. It doesn't matter who the working class is. These parties aren't about the working class. They're about getting rid of the status quo, in my humble estimation.
I think, and I actually think we're going to talk about Cardus's roots. One of the founders of the sort of Christian democratic movement in the Netherlands talked about the importance of actually having a policy, a structural agenda, not just a populist one, but a structural. Although populism matters, so if you're a democratic society, you need to get votes, but a structural agenda. And he sort of talked about, he said, capital will take care of itself. Who will take care of the worker? Is the question that Abraham Kuyper asked. And that's sort of what we're trying to ask here. What is the structural agenda that will actually, address some of those concerns that Sean raised? And Sean, or Renze, I want to ask you a question. You talked about the sort of a third of the definition that you've offered of not needing a college degree or a certificate or a university degree or certificate. So that technically doesn't include my dad. So my dad is somebody who I think was a working class. He's a land surveyor, or a survey technician is actually the the technical, he got his degree at or got a certificate from Loyalist College in Belleville, and he worked for not a lot of wages most of his life. But he's not included in your definition. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about why and what we should make of that. So, or should we make anything of that, for instance?
Well, I think one of the I think that question gets a little bit at the size of the working class, and so Armine mentioned it already. The working class represents 30, just hair over 34% of the Canadian labor force. I should point out that that's the employed labor force. Excuse me. That has actually declined over the last 20 years. So in 2000, the same group of people would have represented, or at the time, would have represented 42% of the population. And over the course of the 20 years, that's declined by about 8 percentage points, which is quite significant. It represents about a 20% decline overall. That's also 6.5 million people. To put that in perspective, some of the analogies we make in the paper are that if they were all concentrated in one geographic area, that would constitute Canada's third largest province. It would also, it's larger than the combined populations of Alberta and Saskatchewan. And to put it in electoral terms, if they had been a singular voting bloc, they would have won the last two elections, at least in terms of popular vote, because they are more than the party in the last two elections that did win the popular vote. So they are a force to be reckoned with. Now, those two things seem a little contradictory at first glance, because they are at once a very large portion of the population, and yet they're on the decline. Those two things are true. A decline, I should say, in terms of population. But I think that the mix there is actually potentially quite dangerous, because there's a temptation to think that the working class doesn't matter. And I'm going to get to your point in a second, but I did want to make this. There's a temptation to think that the working class doesn't matter, but they do represent a very large portion of the population that doesn't do as well socioeconomically as the other classes. Now, to your point, Brian, about a large portion of the technical class would be what we would consider blue-collar workers, your father among them. So if anything, I think that our definition of the working class understates the importance of the working class. To get at the question of why this is important, it understates it. I think if you were to take the technical class and add it to what we consider the working class, you're probably talking about 8, 9, 10 million people. So I think there in public policy there are choices to be made in definitions. I think this is a workable one. I think it's a good one, and it's one that has a lot of backing from other research. But I would say it's one that's a pretty safe definition, because, as I say, if you were to take another one, it would only grow.
Okay, so I'm going to actually go to Angela. I'm going to ask you a question, because you had mentioned earlier, you said they're not really a block. So these Armine and Renze and maybe Sean were sort of saying, look, there's kind of a block here, but your opening statement was that, look, there's actually a lot more going on here when it comes to voting issues or political issues, right? So if you're an immigrant, you may have things that matter more to you for this reason, as opposed to one as a sort of a working class. So can you talk a little bit about, some of those other characteristics? The working class is more likely to be immigrants. How does that affect the question of whether or not there is a political program, or whether there need to be multiple political programs, plural?
Right. So I think it explains why they aren't now already a single voting bloc, right? They don't vote unanimously because there are other things in their lives that are more vote determining. And that could be, so for a lot of voters, I've knocked on doors a lot. I ran for office, I've helped other people. And there are lots of immigrant communities in Ottawa that are like, nope, I came to Ottawa when Pierre Trudeau was prime minister, and I will always vote Liberal, because that, like, in their head, they're good. I've associated that, and it's really easy to kind of hang on to that brand identity for that group. So it doesn't matter who has what policy. And a lot of voting is like that, actually, right? So my family, I grew up in rural Saskatchewan. My brother and sister, my sister sister and brother-in-law would meet your definition of working class. They don't require a university or credential to do what they do. They work at a construction company. They will always vote for Stephen Harper because there was a picture of him with the Bible on his desk. And my sister's like, that's him. I'm going to vote for him. He obviously cares enough about what I care about. So that value connection, right? That value proposition was enough for her. It didn't matter what policy and how that policy affected her. So that's part of the problem. You don't know what the cultural realities of those people's lives are. Do they live in multi-generational homes? Is there a grocery store near them that they can access that food? Are they having difficulty with their kid at school talking to the teacher? Do they, so again, like broad generalizations, but are they an up and coming working class where they're really trying to get their kids educated and they say, nope, you have to study all math and you have to go after school and do this homework? Like, is that their orientation? Or are they like my family that sort of looked down their nose at me that I went to university? They're like, why didn't you get a real job in a trade? Right? And so it matters, I think, what that background and what that cultural context is for you to talk about what kind of policy would appeal to them.
Did you want to get in, Sean, or were you just, okay. Can I ask, there's two other characteristics that came up, and I know, Armine, you've done a lot of...
Maybe just a...
Okay.
Just a minute.
This is Sean and I's relationship. It's perfect.
But I think I take the point that, there are limits to generalizations, of course, but, this is what we do. So, we're stuck with generalizations to extent. So Angela's point is there are various ways, various influences that are shaping these broader political currents, but they're empirical currents. There is plenty of evidence. Ben Woodford's here. Ben's done a lot of thinking on this, on the academic scholarship. There is indeed a shift from the left to the right across the Anglosphere amongst members of the working class. Think of the 2019 British election, the gains the Conservative Party made in the north of the country. The breach of the so-called Red Wall was part of this broader trend of realignment. And it seems to me both the left and the right ought to need to ask themselves tough questions about these broader trends. For the left, it's why this core base of support that has been a kind of bulwark of left-wing politics for decades is suddenly feeling like it doesn't have a home on the left. And I'll leave it to Angela and Armine maybe to talk a bit about some of those trends. On the right, it's something that Armine has raised, which is to say the conventional conservative economic policy program doesn't necessarily align with the interests, experiences, and needs of some of these voters. And so I think it's there's a bit of a race here to see which side gets itself figured out. Does the left figure out why it's these voters for the first time in decades are looking to the right? Or does the right make the types of adjustments it needs to make to its broader policy program to respond to the particularities of the working class? And I don't have a good answer, but I would hypothesize that if, as Angela says, some of the explanations for the shift of these voters to the right are fundamentally cultural, that the right may be better placed to make the kind of technocratic adjustments to the program than the left is, because as Renze said to me this morning, culture just runs deeper than economics. And so I think we're in a kind of interesting moment of ideological flux, which is one of the reasons the four of us are on this stage. I read Armine and I think, man, I agree with her. What's going on? And I think that moment of flux is, it's a bit destabilizing, but it's also... No, but it's also kind of genuinely interesting. And I think it's a time for policy entrepreneurship rooted in facts. And that was the purpose of this paper, to arm the policy world with those facts so people can start to, rethink what a policy program from the working class looks like on the left and on the right.
I would agree with Sean, because one of the things that this paper identifies is something we on the left have been saying for the longest time. The working class is actually women. It's women in service jobs. It's women in public service jobs very often. There's also, retail and restaurants and all of that. But real core unionized working class are racialized women in public service jobs. And to have you come out with this paper and say, hey guys, we're looking at the wrong place. This is what we yelled during the last Ontario election. Like, Doug Ford is not cozying up to the working class. These tradespeople make really good money. They are not, what you would think of as the working class. It's the personal support workers. It's the care economy workers that are actually the working class that need a government to be standing up for them. And that's what this paper sort of, that's the question that you open up with this paper that I think is really valuable.
So Cardus has actually done some work on PSWs, for instance, which is like sort of at the heart of the care. Like when we talk care economy, the personal support worker is like the person who literally does the caring, right? We're talking about someone who's feeding you or wiping your butt if you can't, in a retirement or a long-term care home, for instance. Those are the core, and so.
Or the cleaners.
Or the cleaners, exactly, the janitors and so on, exactly. That's exactly right. And so, Armine, you sort of mentioned it earlier too. You talked about the care economy. Why is it, so, and this is not on our agenda, so this is me throwing it out there to everybody. Why is it that last time I checked, the combination of Dalton McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne were, premier for a long time in Ontario. The Prime Minister Trudeau, who's ostensibly on the left, these are people who self-identify as being on the left. What happened? You guys had power for a long time, and this is a genuine question of what were the structural changes that were put in place that you had the chance to do it? This is, by the way, my blood sugar. This is not a phone, so Monica, thanks I'll take a drink of sugar water known as pop in a minute. But so if that's the case, you've been saying it for a long time. So was it that why wasn't the agenda there for those workers, say, in that camp? So I'll pass it to you.
Yeah. I would like some airtime because Sean took all of my airtime.
Yeah, for sure. Armine, it's all you. You got the floor.
So I'm really shocked that you're asking this question. When it comes to the Trudeau government, we have had, since 2015, we've had the last 2.5, 3 years of pandemic. Until we got there, in my lifetime, I've told you all earlier that all my life as an economist, the overriding policy frame was deregulation, tax cuts, and service cuts. And this was the most progressive federal government I have seen in my lifetime from 2015 to 2020. And then when the pandemic hit, CERB was the most progressive of any government's answer to how do you contain the contagion by making sure people aren't going out there to scramble for work. And we were made whole faster than the US, faster than the UK. We hit our headcounts in jobs. Not only did we hit our headcounts in jobs, people left low-paying jobs and got better jobs. So there's that story. You point to McGuinty and Kathleen Wynne, long period. When Kathleen Wynne was towards the end of her period, and Rachel Notley can be in the same category, NDP, higher minimum wages, paid sick days, bringing in full day junior kindergarten so more people could go to work free at point of contact, 6 hours of free care for 4-year-olds, which shot up labor force participation rates of women because those kids were in safe places, expanded jobs in the care economy that were unionized, had pensions, had benefits, had higher wages. These are incredibly progressive things that were rolled back by the next working for workers government. So were they not progressive? It's as you march through time, you start seeing what economics is reflecting today. We have had for the last few months a conversation about nobody wants to work anymore because we have historic labor shortages. Why do we have historic labor shortages? Population aging is the number one reason why this is happening in every country that had a baby boom after the Second World War. We are seeing it everywhere. So suddenly workers are valuable. Capital, you need capital. You're going to need to change your rules to attract international capital, but you can't get the capital to go to work. I'll give you a very quick example. Last year, 2021, Canada got the highest rate of foreign direct investment it has ever had in its history. A quarter of it went to the Kitchener-Waterloo tech companies. They couldn't find the workers because they had cut their access to childcare. And these are fairly young people that are coming to Kitchener-Waterloo to get jobs. They're having kids, and then the wait lists are insane, and they can't go to work. So this is like the care economy goes to work so you can go to work. That's why we need the care economy. It is vital social infrastructure. You're seeing it as like our system of last recourse, healthcare. We are failing people in terms of housing. We're failing people in terms of access to food as food prices keep escalating. The last thing that happens is people get sick. We're failing them in terms of doctors. So the absolute last system of social protections, the greatest equalizer of all, which was the healthcare system, is now in disarray from one coast to the other. And in places like Ontario, it's because the Working for Workers government decided that workers can't negotiate. They don't respect collective bargaining rights. They put a 1% wage cap. Those nurses are leaving. They're going to agencies, and the same government is paying 3 times as much for 1 hour of work, 3 times as much for 1 hour of work. And the people that are working, they don't even know what they're doing. They're going in as temps. They don't even know what happens in an ICU or what happened to the patient in the community care system the night before. This is just so basic that population aging is having more people leave the system. Did you know 650,000 people tripped the wire from under 65 to over 65 since the pandemic began? Do you know that there are fewer people in the 55 to 64 age group now than when the pandemic began? So fewer people to step into those jobs? Did you know that we have fewer people aged 15 to 25, people entering the labor market, than we did before the pandemic began? There's basic hydraulics at work here, and we are acting as if, we should be talking about the working classes. You're going to have to talk about the working class. It is the new bargaining power in the system. You cannot ignore workers, but it isn't just the working class workers, it's all workers. Workers are going to have more bargaining power than you have seen in half a century, and it's not going away, and you have to deal with it politically. So every party's going to have an answer. The Conservatives just got out at the beginning of the gate. They just got out of the gate faster, but their policies are hypocritical, and they will get exposed for that.
Let me push back a little bit, because I agree with all of that. I don't know, but I agree.
Pushback.
No, but I said but I said that there is presently, not just in Canada, but conservatives across the Anglosphere are grappling with the misalignment that you just described. But I don't think the left is. You just outlined.
I think you're right.
You just outlined a series of what are fundamentally kind of
I'm going to push back.
materialistic responses.
Hold on, go ahead, Sean.
But you outline a series of steps, progressive steps, and yet this trend is still happening.
100%.
And so
I think it's about power.
Well, okay,
because workers don't have power within the Liberal Party. Kathleen Wynne, when her government made those changes, it was a last-ditch attempt. They came late to the understanding that they needed workers to get reelected. And Doug Ford, so I teach labor activists about political economy, and we had a discussion this week. They're like, Doug Ford feels like he's working class. He looks like he's working class. And the students that I was talking to, they recognize that he doesn't have to wear fancy clothes because he gets respect. He has wealth, he has experience, he has connections. He doesn't have to try to seek that status in any sort of obvious way. He can be very confident in just jeans and a t-shirt. And so that confidence actually kind of acts makes it easier for him to connect to the working class. Whereas Andrea Horwath didn't have that same confidence because she is working class. That difference.
But do you honestly think,
and it's about power.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you a question because it's not a pushback. It's actually for clarity. So you think Andrew Horwath lost because she didn't have confidence to talk
Yes.
to the
Did
working?
you watch the debate? Doug Ford was totally comfortable.
But the problem with that argument,
confident.
Angela, is that that would be an explanation in Ontario, and the trends that we're observing are happening across the Western world.
I don't think the same trend's happening in Canada that's happening in the UK. We don't see our voters moving. We just see, like, we're not growing on the left. We're seeing, because normally in Canada, the working class actually goes back and forth between the Liberals and the Conservatives all the time. So you guys are winning from the Liberals, but we're basically a two-party system. So the Liberals don't have, in my view, a fundamentally different economic policy than the Conservatives.
Okay, Renze wants in.
Well,
This is why we invited you people here. This is what I was hoping for. Go, Renze.
Well, I think so. I'm a Western Canadian, and I think the experience.
He's from Edmonton.
Yes. I think the experience in Western Canada is quite different than the experience in Ontario. So in Saskatchewan,
Absolutely,
Manitoba, British Columbia, and a little bit less so in Alberta, there actually is a lot of switching between the right and the left among working class voters, and I think and
I mean,
Sean,
the left hasn't won in Alberta ever until Rachel Notley, and it looks like she could win this time.
that's true. Alberta is a bit
and
of an exception.
Saskatchewan hasn't been in government. The left hasn't been in
True,
government for
but
decades.
there are these shifting elections like 2004 when a number of NDP MPs then lost to the Conservative MPs, and in the 1990s there was a lot of switching between the Reform Party and the NDP, especially in 1993, and so I think if we broaden the conversation to the Federation as a whole, there you do see a little bit more of that switching back and forth with the working class. Now, I think that, and Sean alluded to a conversation we had earlier about how this has a lot to do with culture, and I wonder if there's something there with your father and thinking about the working class from a cultural perspective. I think Doug Ford does kind of maybe represent more of that cultural working class kind of spirit. And whereas if I look at some, and this isn't a value judgment, but when I look at some of the leadership choices that have been made, there have been choices among progressive parties that do seem to move the federal NDP, for example, away from a Western agrarian social gospel movement towards a more downtown Toronto, dare I say it, elite kind of voter group. And I think
that happened with the election of Jack Layton as leader.
Absolutely,
it was Bill Blakey and Jack Layton. So it was social gospel or downtown Toronto.
Yes.
And they should have chose social gospel. And this is just the Cardusian saying that. And I do actually want to, I know that Father Raymond is the back. Father Raymond was editor of Convivium magazine. And I want to encourage everybody to read Bill Blakey, who just passed away, and God rest his soul, was an example of how you could have had somebody who spoke to those material needs, but also set into a cultural context that would appeal to some of those workers, often who have more so-called conservative. I don't like the term of conservative values. I actually don't buy it because as a Christian, it doesn't end up that way. But I just think it's important to note that as
more
you said,
community values,
it's, yeah.
maybe. Yeah.
So okay, and I love this, guys, and I want to keep this going because it's great. But I want to spice it up a little bit more if we haven't gotten there already. So. And I'm going to start with I want to get to labor policy. So when we talk about organized labor, because one of the questions is, why is it that, many voters of, say, CUPE will vote blue, despite what their union tells them or encourages them to vote? They don't tell them. So I want to ask that question, what program does labor have for structure, right? So we talk a lot about minimum wages and so on. And I'm going to start with you on this one, Angela's. So was it Bill C-10, the Kathleen Wynne bill that put in stuff on scheduling, minimum wages? Armine, do you remember?
I don't remember the name of it, but it was
a big comprehensive labor, the big labor push. And I wrote a piece in IRPP saying that actually is going to undermine unions Because what unions are doing is outsourcing the very power that they have, which is solidarity amongst workers, to actually fight for their rights. And what unions should have been advocating for was a reformed labor system or a reformed bargaining system. So can you respond to that? Like, has labor done the work that it needs to do to pay attention to its own lifeblood? As opposed to, do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
And I don't mean to say this as a purely critical thing, but I'd love to hear, like, what explains labor's inability? I don't. Maybe it's not even an inability, but what explains labor's focus on the government? And I know you work with CUPE, but are there other ways? Is that the best way? Could you just respond to that?
So there's actually two tracks that we generally advocate for. One is legislation around how to unionize and what that means. And so there are some simple things that we ask governments for. We ask for single step certification. We have that in BC now, where instead of signing up cards and then you take that to the labor board and you've got 65% of the union or whatever the bar is wants to join a union, and then you have the time for the employer to convince you not to join the union, and then you have the vote. It's just one stage. So you sign the cards, and when you reach a certain number of cards, that's it. You've got the union. And then you go into negotiating, right? So we ask for that legislation. We ask for, the federal government is now looking at banning scabs, or what they call replacement workers. So when we go on strike, if the employer can hire replacements for us, that takes away the power that we have as workers. As workers, our power comes in our ability to withdraw labor. That's it. That's all we've got. And to do it together, right? To build that solidarity that you're talking about. So if they can replace us, well, then the employer has no incentive to bargain with us. And then it goes even further in some jurisdictions, that if you've been on strike for, say, 3 months or 6 months, the employer now no longer has to recognize the union. So if they can wait you out until that, now you're on strike forever. We had, when I was at the Canadian Labour Congress, I think there were folks in Newfoundland that had been on strike for years, because they got replaced by replacement workers and the government no longer had to recognize the union. And so those are really tough things. They're also sort of abstract. So it's pretty tough to talk to workers on the ground who, they're having trouble with their scheduling, they can't get a babysitter, they can't find a spot in childcare, food is getting more expensive, they have to take the bus, 3 changes on the bus to get home. To say, hey, we really want you to bargain for this legislation that makes it easier to unionize. And they're like, why? That's abstract. That doesn't meet my immediate material needs. And so if you're saying, we'll elect this government because they'll do that, again, probably there are other things that are going to outweigh that value to them, including their own family history, their personal relationships. So it doesn't work. The other piece that we do bargain for, because in Canada, we have social unionism. And so what we want for ourselves, we want for everyone. So we don't just want good wages and benefits for our members, we want it for everyone. So we do advocate for higher minimum wages, for sick days. During the pandemic, I was in all kinds of meetings and advocates across the country trying to get governments to do 10 paid sick days. BC went the farthest, they have 5. But I think you're right. It does weaken the union, but I think it's worth it because we can build solidarity. We can feel good about the work that we're doing. And we can have that relationship with the communities that we're living in. And so it actually benefits. The net benefit there outweighs the cost that we're not the only game in town. In the States, a lot of times the unions will provide, car insurance for a cheaper rate and all of that kind of stuff. So the union is really more a business union. It provides services, much like the CFIB does for its members, right? That type of thing. But that's not the type of unionism that most unions in Canada subscribe to.
Well, I'd love to talk to you more about that, but we'll do that at another point because we have lots of time. Armine, you mentioned something about the Waterloo, the company in Waterloo that wanted to hire 40 workers or something like that, but they couldn't. Something that came up as you were talking about that, and this is a genuine difference. We're just going to get it on the table, genuine differences between Cardus and Armine on childcare. Can I ask the question of whether or not there might be competing interests in say, oh dear. Hopefully that's whether there are competing interests in even amongst different groups of women. So say somebody who's working for a tech company in Waterloo, and childcare workers are paid very low in this country. If you're in a licensed facility, for instance, is there a tension between working class? Like, I'd love you to resolve the tension between working class and the professional class, both of which, if I'm not mistaken, Renze, are the two areas where women are disproportionately represented. They're disproportionately represented in the working class as well as the professional class. And is there a tension between those, particularly on the issue of childcare?
Well, is there a tension between men that are professional and working class? Sure. There's tensions between all sorts of people. I'm not quite sure where the question is going.
I'm asking about particularly, and I'm just being honest, the policy agenda with regard to childcare.
Oh, the policy agenda.
Yeah. So
if anybody can have somebody at home being their wife when they are working, everybody needs a wife. If you can have somebody at home taking care of your kids, that's the ideal. But that's like saying the safest for you to avoid a fire and losing everything is having a fireman at the foot of your house. Everybody gets a fireman. Everybody can't have a childcare worker living with them in their home. Professionals often get nannies because they can, right? Because that's the ideal thing. What's your next layer? High quality licensed care. You know, the people that are taking care of your kids are thinking about your kids, not how to save money, not handling like too many kids because it is more profitable to handle too many kids. That's why we want regulations. That's why we want governments in there to set the rules of the sandbox, literally. And that's true also for the labor market. You say, like, why would unions hand over some of this stuff to government? It's like they write the rules of the road for everybody. Those are the rules. Everybody has to play by the rules, right? If the minimum wage is higher, everybody has to pay the legal minimum wage. So of course you want the rules to be fair, the rules to kind of level the playing field. And when it comes to childcare, the market will always prevail. If you've got money, you can buy anything you want. But if you don't got money, what do you got? And how do you make sure the quality of what you've got for your most precious resource, which is your child, is the best quality for the money? How do you make sure you're not wasting a single penny of what you're paying on taxes, on profits, on dividends, and you're making sure that you're not underpaying your staff, and you're making sure that the staff that you are hiring actually have the highest quality so that your child, your preschooler, who is like a sponge, is picking up absolutely everything. This is the most incredible time of their life to learn everything. Like, if you had gold nuggets in your pocket and you had a dog guarding them versus somebody that's an armored guard, you would pick the armored guard, right? This is a precious resource. You want to guard that. You want to make sure it doesn't devalue or get stolen or something corrupts it. Why don't we feel the same way about our kids? When you look at
the government the dog or the armed guard in this analogy?
Well, can I? Well, just I think I want to clarify. So
wait,
you
wait.
go ahead.
The government is what is making sure that you don't get dogs to take care of your precious. Like, you can have it ruleless. Absolutely, you can have it without rules. You can deregulate it because you'll get more quantity.
But what we have is
won't
worse
get
than
quality.
that. We actually have the federal government subsidizing wealthy people to get temporary foreign workers who have precarious labor protections to work in their home.
That gets closer
and so
to the heart
that's
of my
actually
question.
that is where the problem is.
That gets closer to the heart of my question,
Yeah.
which is that if you look at the working class, as defined in this paper, which is people who don't have a college education and are working in jobs that don't require that, they don't actually go to the license. They usually, in general, those aren't the places they're going. And so that's the question. I'm not saying, I don't want to, we have lots of staff who will get into fights with you about the national child, but my question is just a more sociological one about whether there's a tension between the lawyer, right? Who's got.
So this is what intersectionality is. So
this is a question. Yeah. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
So what the question pits women, are women going to be in solidarity with their gender, or in solidarity with their class, right? Because wealthy men always got to have people take care of their kids. Why shouldn't wealthy women? And you're like, well, no, it's a woman's responsibility to have solidarity with class or with her gender. And that's a problem.
I'm not saying that, by the way.
No, but that's sort of that's what I take from the question, right? Like, and I think women do feel guilty about relying on low-wage labor to go do that work and have that equal opportunity. But that's why I want to make sure that those workers in those places are treated well. I want to make sure they have benefits. I want to make sure they have good wages. I want to make sure that they're well-trained and they're providing high-quality care, right? I don't want to be exploiting women so that I can go make a buck and be in solidarity with my class instead of my gender.
Can I just say two things? Number one, when Renze said there are fewer working class people by the definition of you don't need more than high school, if that's the definition of working class, there are fewer of those people since 2000. It's because everybody was told to go and get an education, and they did. Everybody's getting more education. So of course there's just fewer people with just high school. Well, and especially as people also retire, because the people that didn't have high school, they're retiring, right? So the people that are around are better educated than they were 22 years ago. The year 2000, folks, just a heads up, it was 22 years ago. It's almost a quarter of a century ago, right? So anyway, there are fewer people that are not educated, but that takes me to point number two. The people that we do have in our midst who are educated, who would not fall into your description of working class because they have a 2-year diploma in early childhood education. So they would not be in what you're describing as the working class. Get paid now because of the federal funds, $1 more than they were before the deal that they signed with the feds. That means they are earning $18 an hour. Do you know, if you go on the website Indeed and you look for a job as an ECE, an early childhood educator, fully trained, 2 years training, you can maybe make more money as a pet groomer in Ontario these days. Right now, go and look it up. I guarantee you, you can make more money doing almost anything else, and you've got 2 years training. So like, it isn't just how much education you have, but how are you valued by the market and how are you valued by the rules? This is the provincial government that says you don't have to pay a person like that more than $18. And there's plenty of private providers that'll say, cool, that's good. That's good enough for me. I'll get somebody to do it. But they're walking. So we're supposed to be expanding the number of childcare spaces by 86,000 in the next few years, and we are losing childcare providers. We're not expanding, we're shrinking our capacity to provide care for parents. And that is going to affect the entire economy, because as we have more people exiting the labor market than entering it, not just in Ontario, but across the country, if you don't maximize the potential of the working age by providing those basic services like childcare and making sure it is high quality so moms aren't feeling like, oh my God, my kid isn't getting enough stimulation and they're slow in learning how to read or one of these other things. If we don't get this right, we are going to be paying for it for the rest of our lives. All of you in this room will be paying for it because you will not be getting high quality care. And those people that we are not investing in today, that will be workers in 20 years, watch you will reap what you sow, as the Bible says.
Sure. That's true, and I worry about that, given what I sow sometimes. But like, Renze, like, I want you to respond. You wanted to get in. Go for it.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there, and I agree. Like Sean, I agree with most of it.
Renze, that's not what you're supposed to say. Boring.
But I do want to get at a difference here, and that is, I think we have to dig deep into what we mean by quality, because of course parents want good educators to be teaching or to be caring for teaching and caring for their children at what I agree is a very precious age. But in addition to that, there's an element that I think this conversation so far is missing, and that's flexibility. And so I'd like to, get back to who the working class is, not just as educators, but who they are as childcare consumers as well. And what what our paper showed is that the working class is far more likely to be working in multiple jobs, and in their main job to be working part-time, which suggests to me that you can think of someone who works a 4-hour shift in the middle of the day, another 4-hour shift in the evening. Excuse me. Which isn't at all surprising. We saw earlier that that the working class is predominantly in the services producing sector. So these are people who are working while other people are eating, or who are working while other people are going for entertainment. And so of course they're going to need childcare at odd hours. The problem is that the kind of childcare that tends to be funded by government programs is the licensed care, which is also the kind of care that is much more likely to be working in the standard care hours of 9 to 5. And that works well if you are a professional class worker. It works significantly less well if you're a working class worker. In fact, I saw one thing from Statistics Canada that showed that unlicensed care is 9 times more likely to offer weekend services than center-based care. So I come back to the question of what is quality, and I think we need a much more expansive understanding of what parents are actually looking for, especially the working class, because these are the people who, if they're going to succeed in the labor force, we need to make sure that our childcare policies are wrapped around them as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, and we talk about this all the time in the labor movement when we're talking about childcare, because you have people like, postal workers who might be working in the evening because it's easier to do the shift that way. And what we see a lot of families do is sometimes like one parent will take an early shift and another parent will take the later shift. And so you basically don't see your partner when the kids are little. And for shift work, we don't have like at hospitals, and it's more than just the working class, right? It's anybody at a hospital. So lots of nurses and doctors don't have childcare that works for them unless you can get it from your family. And so this is a problem. And it's been, I think, part of the broader care economy's asks. We've asked for this. We said we need shift work. We need to have childcare on PD days. What if I have to work on a PD day? So you need that kind of responsive, flexible childcare. But we don't even have childcare that works. We don't have childcare that works for most people. And so we don't even have the basic minimum, let alone to be able to provide that. So I don't think that is a failure of the provision mechanism we've chosen. Or I do actually think it's a failure because we have market. Those center-based care, that's not necessarily quality. They're earning $14 an hour. They have stuff in the cabinet, like crayons and books and stuff to show when the inspectors come, but the kids aren't allowed to use it, right? So we're not saying that the system we have now is good. We need to invest dramatically in this system so that it works for anyone, because childcare, quite honestly, doesn't work for anyone. And it's hardly better than it was when I was a kid. I'm the oldest of 4. My mom used to take me as a nurse into the hospital and I'd sleep in an extra bed, right? Because I was the easiest one. Then like the other kids get farmed out to different grandparents. Grandparents can take 4 kids.
You could respond to something extremely radical and crazy, and then we're going to move on to the next thing. So you go first.
Okay. The one thing I would say about that is we do have an experience of a long-term of a system that's basically a public system or publicly.
I would argue it's not
publicly funded system.
It's very privatized.
That has been around.
Even in Quebec, it's very privatized.
But
that was the flaw in the system.
This is a very similar. It's the model for what the federal government.
It's not the model.
Is.
The federal government said public spaces are not for profit.
Well,
based out of learning from Quebec, actually.
But the point I'm trying to make is to actually say that you're right, that this issue of flexibility is a problem in a lot of childcare spaces, including Quebec. Is the point I'm trying to make. And despite all of the efforts that Quebec has made, it has still found that flexibility continues to be a problem, which is and not to mention the long waiting lists, which is in fact why the Quebec government had to layer on top a tax credit system, a refundable tax credit system that actually gave money directly to parents, because I think they recognized.
I don't think they had to; they chose to.
Well, they chose to, and I think I think what I'm getting at is that's a reasonable response in the face of this kind of a system, is to flow that money directly to parents so that they can choose and find the flexible childcare that works best for them.
May I just say something?
Yeah, you can, and I want to move us on.
I think what you're
talk a lot about
I think what you're seeing here is
work is not valued.
but I think what you're seeing here is a fruitful, fun conversation, which is in part a function of the empirical and conceptual work that we've done in the paper, right? That a conversation about the working class and childcare is where we need to be. I think we use a line in the paper, something like, if you want to have an inclusive and genuine working class agenda, it needs to meet the working class where they are, where they live and where they work. And I think, like, going back to one of the underlying motivations was that we had the sense that there was a disconnect between the kind of political rhetoric about the working class and the working class experience, and that we needed to adjust our political and policy thinking about the working class to reflect the types of occupations they do, the places that they live, their economic circumstances, etc., and that would manifest itself in a different type of policy agenda. If the working class is predominantly in the goods producing part of the economy, then an agenda for them is going to involve a whole host of policy areas that is going to be different. So we've dwelled a lot on childcare, but we could have easily talked about labor standards for unconventional work, which would not have been a working class policy agenda when we were talking about General Motors workers.
Education, portable benefits,
transportation,
transportation.
how all of these issues. So I guess we're not going to all get up here and sing Kumbaya tonight and walk out of here with a broadly supported working class agenda. But if we leave here focused on the specific issues, we're bringing to bear our different normative points of view to the specific issues concerning the working class, rooted in a clear empirical understanding of who they are, the types of jobs they do, where they live. That's a win.
Yeah, I agree. And I am going to move us on from childcare after I say my radical thing, which is, I actually think the man is actually the business community and the structure in which you're required to work in those ways apart from your children. So I'm even more radical on this one. I'm like, take your kids to work day should be every day. And this is somebody who's gone through COVID, so at home. So I'm still on that. I still think it's there. I think it's at least the type of big structural thing we need to be thinking of, right? That rather than simply trying to nibble at the edges of what is a fairly legible framework on both the state and the corporate side. But that's another for another day. But it opens up the question about culture, and I sort of want to end there. One of the things that has become true culturally for us is that it is far easier, and this is true in things like marriage arrangements and other things, it is far easier to talk to, socialize with, marry, do business with people of your own class than it used to be. There used to be a variety of ways in which people from a variety of classes, whether it was through religious communities or whether it was through lodges or things like that, interacted with one another. And my question for you, and this one wasn't on the list, but it's one that I'd love for you to answer, is do you think that's true? Do you think we are actually stratifying in terms of not just economic stuff, but in terms of social relationships? And one of the ways to test that, I guess we wonder, would be to say, like, do you have any friends who are working class? And how often do you talk to them? And so maybe you can answer that question, and we can lead that into the sort of the end and then move into questions from the crowd, which I'm sure there are plenty. So in that way, and what I'm getting at is the question of, like, we've talked about classes, but I'm interested in, Cardus is interested in social solidarity amongst all Canadians, right? There seems to me to be, we should be interested as a policy group in providing, for the working class's needs, but insofar as we are all Canadians and we're all sort of brothers and sisters in this country, and how would we actually understand one another's needs and actually serve one another that way? So just love to hear from you if anyone has any response on that. If not, we can.
I'll weigh in on that.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think fewer people go to church and synagogue. Maybe not fewer people go to mosque. So there's less mixing it up in a kind of social way. I think fewer people even go shopping. They do more online everything because of the pandemic. I think fewer people have big families and extended families. So there's less mixing it up that way, where you would naturally have people with very different outcomes in life in an extended family. I think people are aging. Right now, 1 in 5 Canadian is over the age of 65. In a few years, it's going to be 1 in 4. A lot of older people live by themselves. So I think we're just not connecting with one another the way we used to. And economically speaking, the positive sorting that you mentioned at the outset has been documented for decades, that over time, you are seeing likes marry likes. Birds of a feather flock together, and they sort, like, you know, doctors now marry nurses, and nurses marry, or doctors are more now likely to marry another doctor than they are a nurse. And, you know, lawyers are likely to marry lawyers, and post office workers marry, you know, people that work in retail. That positive sorting has been happening for decades, and you can see it in all the data. So economically speaking, you tend to move in tighter and tighter circles, and we're kind of circling the drain here, because what is happening to political discourse is, especially since the pandemic, and especially since the arrival of fake news, like deliberate fake news, where we are siloed in our own circles of conversation, that if I don't agree with you, I'm not going to talk to you. So I think everything is making it more difficult to do exactly what this evening and what you were saying. I think everybody here would like to be able to listen to one another and actually learn from one another. Those aha moments are amazing. When you hear somebody and you hadn't thought about that before, tell me more, right? Like that experience is priceless. And it is, I think, the way we meet one another and discover new places that we can travel to together, and ways that we can go together forward. But I think it's getting harder and harder to do. And so I salute you and Cardus for trying to convene this evening, and recognizing that we don't start in the same place, but we might actually discover some sightlines that we didn't know existed for each other's world.
Just on that point, I completely agree, of course. And I said this earlier. Let me reemphasize. Armine mentioned earlier that I think in and around what we didn't appreciate at the time, but we now recognize in hindsight, is that in and around the global financial crisis, a kind of ideational framework that undergirded our politics had fallen apart.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons things have been so crazy for the past decade or so is that we've been operating without a kind of common ideational framework. We're trying to kind of figure it out. And I think it's produced some really bad and awful developments. But it's also produced some kind of interesting new prospects for kind of cross-ideological or cross-partisan engagement. That in the absence of this, you know, if you think about it this way, from, you know, something like the general theory to something like the stagflation crisis, we had a, you know, Keynesian consensus, a mixed economy model, however one describes it, from Frederick Hayek winning the Nobel Prize in December 1974 to something like the crash of Lehman Brothers. We had a Washington consensus model that, you know, broadly connected Tony Blair to David Cameron, and nothing replaced it yet. And I think we're working through that. And what I think is interesting, as I said, is that it's opening the doors to new and different ideas. It's unedifying at times. We're seeing, you know, I don't know if people follow Tyler Cowen's blog, Marginal Revolution. I'd encourage you to read today as a piece. This is particularly for those on the center right, as a piece today on the similarities and differences between what he calls classical liberals and the new right. And I think it's a useful kind of framework for thinking about some of what the absence of a common ideational framework has done to conservative politics. But that's a digression. When I read Armine and Angela these days, as I said earlier, I'm surprised. One of the most bravest contributions to public policy discourse is the work that Armine has done, where she says, we are addicted to temporary foreign workers in this country. We are addicted to low-skilled immigration on the part of capital who want to disrupt the proper functioning of supply and demand in a market economy to produce an equilibrium that's to the benefit of workers. As Armine said earlier, we are entering a period that ought to reshape the power imbalance between workers and capital. And what capital and governments are doing is trying to disrupt that proper functioning of the market through temporary foreign workers and low-skilled immigration. To put that in perspective, what people don't appreciate is that we're bringing in 400,000 people a year. That's the sticker number, but the true number is way higher than that.
1.2 million.
Way higher than that. Through
And there's not a lot of transparency in those numbers.
Exactly. And Armine, someone who has been at the heart of progressive politics for progressive. I misspoke, not progressive politics, but kind of progressive ideas. Progressive ideas has put this on the table, and she's right. And so it seems to me, I think we're living in a kind of interesting time, and I think the fundamental question when it comes to the working class is who's going to adjust their priors to reflect what we're trying to convey in this paper. And I actually said, as I said earlier, I kind of think the right might do it first, because for better or for worse, progressives are kind of locked into a set of cultural propositions, which you may or may not agree with, but I think are a lot of working class Canadians, working class voters, don't see themselves in. And that represents an opening for the right. The question, of course, is the right going to walk through that open door? And, I think that is very much yet to be seen.
So I'm going to say thank you for that. And I'm going to draw everyone's attention to one thing that I think, when we talk about things that everyone can agree on as sort of an end, and then we can sort of bicker and fight over the means, right? I think, and I think there's one or two MPs in the crowd, but if we talk about the disability benefit, was passed second reading. I'm not sure which, it passed a reading. It's going to committee at this point, and it got unanimous consent from every MP in the House.
It's because there's nothing in it.
Pardon?
That's because there's nothing in
exactly.
it.
No, I agree with you, Angela. I'm 100% with you.
I'm 100%.
But what I think is fascinating, though, is that what we now have. I think if you listen to the speeches of the people who are responding to it, there was, I think, and is broad recognition from both the Conservatives, the NDP, the Liberals, the whole shooting match, that we're not doing enough. And we got to do something. Now, yeah, it's totally vague. You could drive a convoy through it. I'll be here all week. But I do think, though, there's something, if you listen to the speeches, and I listened to the speeches, even like Cardus itself, we did some work on disabilities as part of our Work is About More Than Money project. And what's fascinating is the first call we got was from a very left-wing person who's heading up an organization that would be considerably far more left in terms of, the sort of political spectrum. And we sort of talked to one another. We're like, yeah, we got to do something here, and here's a plan to do it. So I think there's more hope for it. I hope that that's true for the working class. And on the last point, and just to your point and your good words, Armine, my hope is that it's more than just economics, that we find a way to actually engage with and actually meet the working class in Canada, and that we can actually build a Canada that's a place of solidarity. And you talk about the lack of sort of an ideational framework, or whatever word you want to use. But for me, for Cardus, that framework is a Christian democratic one in which the terms subsidiarity and solidarity need to be held in common. And that's what we're trying to do here at Cardus. That's the framework we're trying to provide, and which provides more space than some of those other places. And for people who, might not otherwise be the normal co-travelers or pilgrims. And so I want to say thank you to these folks who came out and gave it tonight. And we did get started a little late, and after the chirping from my phone, we do have still some time though from questions. If you guys are game to take a few, I see that there's a bunch of them. I'm gonna just, if you can all raise your hands, I'm gonna try to take an order. Okay, so you were first, so you're gonna go first, and then we're gonna go to you second, then we'll go to you third, and then Ray, if you don't get in, then we'll. So go ahead.
Based on your definition, it turns out I actually am working class. So thank you for confirming my blue collar bona fides. I work for the Ottawa Police Service in the Communications Center. I answer 911 calls. Just need a high school diploma to do the gig. And I think it's funny that you mentioned the convoy, just as a little slide at the end.
You got to get to your question, but are you going to go on about the convoy? Because I'm a little nervous about that.
During the convoy, and this has to do with the idea of cultural versus economics. So our call center was inundated with phone calls from all over the world. I took phone calls from Australia, Wales, Germany, all over Canada, all over the United States, with people calling to express how, whatever. But the thing that I realized watching the convoy coverage, talking to these people on the phone, the one thing that lacked from the entirety of what seemed like the whole movement was a lack of class consciousness. It wasn't a class movement in my perspective, right? And it's cultural. It's just cultural. That's all it really boiled down to. And I think that when we talk about the idea of identifying who these classes are, and Angela, at the beginning, we were talking about how that huge swath of who represents working class, I think it does a disservice to the working class because people don't realize that they're there.
Yeah.
They don't realize, hey, that's me.
Yeah.
That precarity, that it's there. And so I think the problem, and especially from the left, like I live in the glebe, right? And I mean, which is crazy, it's wild.
It's a right-wing bastion in Ottawa.
But that's what I mean.
I think
From an
Ian
economic
Lee was
perspective, it should be, right? It's a bunch of rich people, a bunch of richies, right? I slid in. Don't ask me how. But the thing is because of everything's cultural at this point, there is no class consciousness. And I think that the problem is that one thing that we don't talk about with the working class is its opposition to the rentier, like for lack of a better word, the rentier class. So we don't talk about what does that mean? How do we, is there a room for any political party, the right or the left or whoever it is, to say, to reach the working class, we need to comfort the afflicted, we need to afflict the comfortable. But nobody talks about that, right?
So people do talk about that. My friends talk about that. But our political, this is what I wanted to say to your question about like, why don't we have this? Our political conversation in Canada is so narrow. I would get invited on political panels, and I was the most extreme left person on the panel in the conversation. I would never be able to get in anything radical. Like saying we should have public ownership of energy utilities was like radical left, right? We don't get that conversation in Canada. It's happening. There's more podcasts. There's like Harbinger Network. There's a bunch of podcasts. There are like alternative media that are talking about it.
Hub Dialogues.
But it hasn't worked into the mainstream.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And none of our political parties have picked it up. This is why I'm saying like the NDP, lots of activists within the NDP have said, you need to start talking about this. It will resonate more broadly than you think it will.
And I'm curious, when you talk about there's a lane for the right to find this working class.
Yeah.
Does that lane also include the idea of afflicting, you know what I mean, for lack of a better word?
So
that's why
okay,
I
so
raised
Armine, go ahead. Yeah. Okay.
No,
yeah.
anger, just anti-establishment anger, man. And that is classless, right? You get rich people, poor people. That's why Trump had those people that owned yachts that were for Trump, right? Like, you remember those guys? Like, it's about channeling the anger that's out there and the anti-establishment sentiment. And that convoy was about, we hate what is. we want something else. And so if you're experiencing it as more cultural than anything else, I would love to hear more of the definition of what you call culture. Like what culture was expressing itself there? He was basically an FU culture, right?
I think from a cultural perspective, it was, you're not my dad, you can't tell me what to do.
Right. It was totally libertarian, 100%, but it was also against anybody that was going to try and tell you to do. Like, it was actually active. It wasn't just, you can't tell me what to do. It's like, I want you out. I don't want to play by your rules. And I'm going to stay here until you can't ignore me.
But my friends have been protesting the WTO and the IMF and all of those organizations for like 20 years, right? They got arrested in Toronto. And then now all of a sudden, Pierre Poilievre is like, those elites said that, and we're like, what about us? We hate them too.
I think there are, okay, so yeah, no, go for it, Renze, go for it. This is, yeah. Go ahead, Renze.
When I hear this, I get a little nervous because as you can imagine, I don't think a discussion about class necessarily entails class warfare. I think. Oh,
there's already class warfare. But you guys are winning.
Wait, who are you guys? Just careful with that. Who's who?
Wow. Broadly, the other class from me. I don't know. I don't want to assume anyone's class here.
I think how I would respond to that is that there are a lot of ways to respond to the concerns of the working class, and some of them may be structural, some of them may be revolutionary, but some of them can also be incremental and work from a system that has actually worked reasonably well in terms of economic growth, but recognizing the fact that some people don't participate in that growth. And
that seems like a very liberal position.
Well, I think
liberal democratic.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you mean small L liberal,
yeah.
I think yes. I think that's fair to say. It's also a small C conservative approach as well. But I would just say that I think there's a way to address the concerns of the working class without necessarily afflicting the comfort of that. So
I think that's like our fundamental.
Because the more we talk about polarization of our politics, I think there actually is a responsibility on both sides to ensure that this doesn't break out into open warfare.
Yeah, I just want to again put a shout in for my homeboy, the Pope, John Paul II, who talks about actually the need for class struggle. And I know a lot of conservative Catholics haven't read that. But when he talks in Centesimus Annus, 100 years, which is written 100 years after Rerum Novarum, which was the sort of first modern encyclical, which was set at a time of extreme, social foment and actual revolution, he actually talked about the importance of class struggle. He says, but the difference with the struggle, there's two types. There's a struggle that wants to destroy, right? And there's a struggle that is sort of based in terms of doing justice for the person who is worthy of love. And I do think that distinction is critical. Both will involve may involve some sort of pain or some sort of structural change. Maybe even you can look to traditions that will afflict themselves through asceticism, and I don't mean whipping, but perhaps giving of their own money or going hungry for the sake of others. I just think that there are ways in which you can address class struggle that don't necessarily lead to revolution. And I think that's something we all want to avoid, because then we lose the ability to do this type of thing and disagree in peace.
Absolutely. So. I mean, my version of class struggle is, having a protest on the lawn and then going home. No diesel horn.
You can just drop your mic there if you want. Okay. So Sean, and Armine, you were totally expecting this type of thing to come up at tonight's conversation, right? Yeah. It's like Sean had an interview with me and I talked about Jesus. He was uncomfortable. It was great. You had the question there, and then we're going to move on.
Thank you. Jacob Optum Member of Parliament for Langley Aldergrove. I'm a Conservative Member of Parliament. It means I'm on the opposition side, but I did vote in favor of the Canada Disability. And here's maybe another little surprise that people don't know. I voted in favor, together with all my colleagues, Conservative colleagues, to not only provide all the pandemic relief programs, but to expand it. At one time we were saying to the government, you're not doing enough. Mm-hmm. There's a role for government in a time of crisis to pump liquidity into the marketplace and confidence in the minds of the public. And so we were saying, your benefits are just not big enough. You need to do this, and the liberals, from conservatives. But here's the big difference between liberals and conservatives. We know when to shut the tap off. They don't. They just keep on spending and spending. Reminds me of a comment from former Minister of Finance. I'm getting to my question, Bill Morneau, who, after he left the caucus, he was cut loose from the Liberal Party talking points at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, I think it was in Toronto, said the problem with this current government is that they're more obsessed about wealth distribution than wealth creation. He said that in the context of Canada's productivity numbers being substantially lower than the United States and most other GCC countries. The Canadian worker produces about 67% of what an American worker does in the trade.
That's partly a measurement problem, actually, and it's been that way for years.
It has been
through conservative and liberal governments.
I'm not blaming it on the liberal government. I'm quoting Bill Morneau. But anyways, here's my question, really to the economists. I'm sorry.
Armine.
Thank you for your comments. I'm very impressed with your knowledge and your passion, but I might disagree with some of your conclusions. But you were discounting trickle-down economics, right? But I just wonder what you say about growing the pie rather than just talking about distributing the pie.
Does it have anything to do with cakes?
I have a video to show you, but I can't show it to you now. What do I think about growing the pie? I think that actually the economy is not a pie, it's a layer cake. And you cannot have the part of the economy that you were talking about without the foundational things, which includes the planet on which we live, from which we pull out all the raw materials, the way we provide care for one another that is unpaid, the way we educate and care for one another, which is paid, the public infrastructure like roads and bridges and utilities and that sort of thing, then you can start talking about the economy. But we are systematically under investing in all of those other things that maximize everybody's potential. And in an era of population aging, when we're going to have the smallest working age cohort we have seen in over half a century, we are going to rely on people that are younger than you and I. I'm just taking a look at your hair, and I'm assuming that you and I are roughly in the same age group. We are going to be relying on Matt over here and all the people that are much younger than us very shortly. And we are going to need to support them if they choose to have children, so that their children, because we're going to need all hands on deck. We just don't have enough people working. And you can bring in more people, but every country that had a baby boom after the Second World War is going through this at the same time. So if you think there's just a tap you turn on and you get all the good workers, think again, because we're going to be competing with everybody else at the same time. So why would people come to Canada? Because we would be a people magnet, because we're the best place to live. We've got the best social infrastructure. We've got the best housing. We've got the best physical infrastructure. We've got the best jobs. That's the only way we're going to win this game right now. Right now, we are the 9th largest economy in the world. I hear what you're saying about productivity lagging. As Angela said, productivity has been lagging since the 60s in this country. If you're going to compare us to the United States, measurement of productivity is fraught. You would know Don Drummond and David Dodge. You would know those names. I have been at many meetings when Don Drummond and David Dodge would throw up their hands and say, we did everything in the recipe book for increasing productivity. We threw the book at it. We did everything we knew how to do, and it's still lagging. What was missing? What did we do wrong? We did deregulation, we cut taxes, we did everything to spur investment and grow the pie. And it did not trickle down. And it did not improve productivity. So I'm with you that it would be great if we did things that spurred productivity, but we're not only addicted to temporary foreign workers, we're addicted to low wages. We've been in a foot race for 25 years with the United States to be the country with the biggest share of low wage workers in the world, right? We are, well, in the developed world, in the OECD. We've been in a foot race with them, and we've been winning for the last decade. If you are addicted to low wages, you are going to get low productivity. That's just the math of it. You want better productivity? Make workers pay workers so that they are valued more, because then you're going to have to figure out, how am I getting my dollar out of these people, or how am I replacing them with technology? One of these two things, where you're maximizing the potential of every person that is in the workforce. If you are with me on that, I will vote Conservative.
Well,
we should stop there.
we're gonna we're gonna
turn that into an ad.
Yeah, so, anyone recording this? So we're gonna have. So you're next.
Okay.
Armine, sorry, Angela, you go, and then Renze. Yeah.
Okay, this is what I'm talking about when I talk about we have class warfare right now. Bill Morneau is firmly in that class, the owner class, the rentier class, and putting him in as finance minister is class warfare. The Liberals were elected on a platform of actually implementing some pretty good tax fairness policies that would help reverse some of the trends that we've seen, that Mark Carney has talked about. Like, it's not just like super left-wing like me, I don't know. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No. This is there a whoopee cushion over there?
I didn't know that he was a comrade now.
But he endorsed my favorite mayoral candidate, so you got to throw Mark Carney some love. So yeah, and it goes back to what Armine's thinking about, the model of the economy that we had. Like, I'm an economist as well. The model of the economy that we had as a pie, and we need to grow the pie by deregulating these things, by making, if we make Bill Morneau's class happy, everything will work out. It did not work out anywhere. And that's why the working class is mad everywhere. That neoliberalism age has come to an end, and we don't know what's next. We are in this period where we're kind of trying to figure it out. But what we do know is that didn't work. But we're still not sure how to transition and who to take advice from and what model of the economy does make sense. But what Armine and I always talk about is that you have a healthy economy when workers are paid well. When workers are paid well, they go to their local grocery store and they spend money. They go to their coffee shop and spend money. When workers are not paid well, they can't afford to do that, right? They can't afford to volunteer because they have to work a third job. So our social fabric erodes when we have that type of economy. And I think that's part of the problem for where we are now. Nobody has any time to do any of that work, or most of us don't have that time to do that work that builds communities beyond just economic.
I think you get at stuff that there'd be a lot of alignment between you and Cardus and our work in economics program. We look forward to you voting for the blue laws that will make sure all stores get shut one day a week. Will be perfect.
I would love that. When I moved to Nova Scotia, there was no Sunday shopping. It was amazing.
Great. Well, let's work on that together. Let's work on that together.
I loved it.
And in a pluralist, we'll set it up for a pluralist society. So let's talk about that. Renze, you wanted to get in.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Mr. Van Pop's question around productivity and tie it to your question around low wages. One thing that I regret we haven't gotten into this evening yet is the question of education as much because it's pretty huge. So we didn't get into it, but briefly, if you remember the definition, it's not about what kind of education you have. It's the kind of job that you're in and the educational requirements for that job. And yet, over half, 53% of the working class actually have college diploma or higher. 14% of them have a university degree. And that represents a huge opportunity cost for the Canadian economy. These are people who, by and large, went to university or went to college expecting to get a job afterwards that they didn't. So what's going on there? And I think that if these people, if they were maximizing their educational investments, and we're in higher paying jobs as a result, that might go some way to solving some of the productivity issues that we have in our economy as well. So
I would disagree. I would say that person's bachelor education might make them more productive in that job.
Absolutely, I think it may, but I would say that's I agree. Let me be clear. I'm not discounting the value of that education. I think, as a philosophy graduate myself,
humanities graduates unite. Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm probably one of the only ones working here. So I 100% agree with you.
Yeah.
The value of the education is there. It's just that I'm not sure that that translates fully into economic value. It translates. It makes you a better person. I absolutely agree with that. It makes you it may teach you a lot of great things about life, and it may actually improve your life as well, including outside of work. But there is that economic aspect that is missing, and that's a serious problem. And that calls, by the way, for a reconsideration of the kinds of education that we fund as well. Maybe we should be funneling more money into a layer of education, colleges and trade schools, that are more likely to get the working class into higher paying jobs.
Like the Quebec system of
Anyway.
CEGEPs?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Well, not necessarily. I'm not necessarily talking about CEGEPs. What I'm talking about is I'm actually asking whether or not we funnel, whether provincial governments especially funnel too much money into universities and ought to be sending money to trade schools and colleges.
Yeah, there's some discussion about where that allocation goes in terms of the total education budget. So, sir, you have the last question of the night.
Yes, hello everyone. Okay, so I represent all classes, I think. Yeah, because I was born in Haiti. Okay? I'm gonna get my question. Yeah. It is hard to grow up as a young person, not know how to read or how to write. And I'm the first generation in my family to do that.
Bravo.
All right, so now it's hard. I mean, it's difficult to survive, to work, to do anything in this world, pretty much, if you don't have to be that way. Now, my question is for the working class, or whatever class you're in. So, I heard that there's recession coming. If it's true, then what are we doing, everybody, to prepare ourselves for the working class?
That's a great question. There's a recession coming. What are we doing to prepare the working class for that? Assuming there is a recession coming. Armine, Armine will go first.
This recession isn't going to be like any other recession we've seen. Usually what happens in a recession is that more people are thrown out of work, and those numbers normally climb. But what we are in, the moment we are in before this perfect storm approaches us, is unemployment rates at half-century lows, vacancy rates for jobs at levels we've never seen before, a higher share of every age group working than we have ever had before, except for men, prime-age men, but that's a whole other story. Certainly higher now than it was during the pandemic. So people are putting in more hours. People are working, have more jobs, and are less unemployed at a rate we haven't seen in half a century. So yes, a recession may mean fewer people get hired. It may mean some people lose their jobs, and the people that will lose their jobs are the working class. They're the people that are always the people that get hit first, whether we're talking about a pandemic or any kind of economic downturn. It is the people that are the poorest and the most vulnerable, working in the most marginal industries, that will lose their jobs first. What is going to be different about this recession is not whether you're working or you're not working. It's whether you can afford food, heating, and housing, because those prices will not quit. This recession is going to be about this fall, more people going hungry, more people choosing between heating and eating, more people not being able to pay their rent and losing their housing, and there isn't a cheaper place to go to because housing has become more expensive. And people telling one another, we can't do anything because that will pour fuel on the fire of inflation. I'm looking at you. Because that is going to be an immoral position. If people get sicker quicker, there are no doctors for people, and they go to hospital rooms, and the hospital rooms are closing. It's chaos if we don't help people, whether they have a job or not, to feed themselves and keep themselves sheltered. There is something terrible coming at us this fall, and it is not a recession. It is us not caring about people getting sicker quicker because we stood by and did nothing.
Yeah, of course. One response. Yeah, of course.
Maybe this is why, for example, in Haiti right now, well, most of the time, there is always this movement going all over the city, burning people's businesses, burning people's houses, meaning those who are tough, pretty much, they're losing everything right now.
In Haiti?
Yes. So this
Right now?
Right now, yeah. Well, it happens every 5 years. Yeah. Yeah. So like,
Well, thankfully, we don't live in Haiti at the moment.
so what can we do to make it there?
Yeah, well, I don't know, talk to Matt, because, you know, Matt and you guys, you might be on the same, you might be tapping into an energy that we would prefer to think doesn't exist. And I hope you're both wrong. I hope that doesn't come to a neighborhood near you. But if we didn't do anything to prevent people from going hungry and losing their housing, then maybe we deserve it. The winter is going to be very cold.
On that hopeful note, I am actually going to try to just end with a hopeful note, and I think there is hope, partially because I think that there are solutions to be offered from both ends. So, for instance, housing. As much as we may or may not like the term gatekeepers, that's very true that in certain circumstances, in my city of Hamilton, for instance, one of the reasons for not enough housing or for renters not having bargaining powers because they don't have any options, and one of the reasons is that there are some who would prefer for fewer houses to be built because it keeps the price of the houses they're building up now, right? I do think that there is a legitimate, and I actually think that there's an interesting confluence of political, I don't want to say forces, but political ideas sort of fomenting around some of these things. And I hope that tonight was actually the beginning of further conversations around things like blue laws, for instance, or other things that will allow workers to live full lives as Canadians, to contribute to the fullness of society, not just in terms of working, sleeping, and dying. Although all three of those things, for at least for me, are good. The dying one I would hold off on for a while, but there is something I think that we are sort of beginning to sort of scratch at the surface of, and I hope that we can continue this conversation. I want to thank, I'm going to start with Armine and Angela, as your first time here. I want to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart for what I thought was I think it shows great courage, and I also think it shows a certain amount of hope and solidarity, even being willing to join this conversation. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank Sean, Renze for doing all this work, and thank you so much for coming. That's the end of the formal program, but we've got lots of wine and beer at the bar. Please drink some of it. We bought it for you. It's there for you. There's still lots of wine and cheese, and please enjoy the rest of your evening. We hope to see you again at another Cardus event. So good night.